Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend, Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Joe. How's it going?
It's going okay. Just okay. Mainly because of a radio show I listened to this morning. It was just a local radio station talk show host who had a guest who was a science writer talking about the Omicron variant and how this writer feels like things are going to get much, much worse before they get better. Made me think about things I'm doing in the here and now, like I run an open rec volleyball group, and I wonder whether that group will still be playing indoors beginning very soon. And, you know, I bought tickets for my family to see To Kill a Mockingbird on Broadway. Will that show even be open by the time we get there next month? That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty, which is a good baseline for our episode this week.
That's exactly why I raised it, because it's just the latest in this seemingly unstoppable tide of bad news that's been washing over us in the last couple years, really. You know, we got a pandemic, we've got climate change, we have complete dysfunction in the government, and here we are on the brink of the holiday season, surrounded by all this negativity, all this misery, and my question to you is, make it stop. Give me some good news. Is there any good news out there that we can talk about for a little while and get our minds off all this misery?
Well, I believe there is. Thank you for asking the question. Like you say, on this podcast, we do tend to get down into some pretty dark and discouraging topics.
Yes.
And I think it's important to make sure we're also taking time to focus on the positive.
Agreed.
So I took your question, I ran some Google searches, and I came up with the following list of reasons to be optimistic in 2021 as we go into 2022. And let's begin with something that we've all been struggling with for the last 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic. Obviously, there are some segments of this country and some parts of the world where vaccinations are lagging behind where we'd like them to be. And partially as a result of suboptimal vaccination rates, COVID-19 variants keep coming out. The latest, which you've mentioned, has been getting a lot of press lately. It's the so-called Omicron variant that was first identified in South Africa. And as was the case with the science writer who you heard interviewed on that radio show, the fear is that a variant will emerge like Omicron that might be an even more deadly version of the virus, or possibly that the vaccines currently available will not be able to stop it. And looking even further down the road, scientists agree that future pandemics are pretty much an absolute certainty, and there might even be another pandemic within our lifetime. So that seems like a pretty bad situation.
It does.
But there are reasons for optimism. First, for the short term, scientists are still taking a close look at Omicron. But as the New York Times reported last week, early indications are that it doesn't appear to be that serious a threat. It does spread very quickly. It's quite catchable, and that is a concern. But the early indications are that the Omicron variant of COVID-19 may be a less severe form of the disease. Patients in South Africa who tested positive for Omicron often exhibited no symptoms at all. They were in the hospital for completely different reasons, so that's good. But there's one longer-term reason for optimism as well, which is we've gotten so much better at developing vaccines. It wasn't so long ago that it would have taken years or even decades to develop a vaccine for a new virus. But the first COVID-19 vaccines were developed in 11 months. And some people were concerned about that. They figured that a vaccine could only be developed that quickly if safety measures had been bypassed. And while it's true that the federal government fast-tracked these vaccines, it's also true that medicine now has techniques and technologies that allow for much more rapid vaccine development. The first step in developing a modern vaccine is to sequence the virus's genome. Once we know that genetic sequence, it identifies the viral proteins that the vaccine could target. And it wasn't long ago that genetic sequencing like that would have taken years. For instance, it took 13 years to sequence the human genome, but now it can be completed in just a few hours. Also, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines employed a technique that delivers short strands of messenger RNA into human cells, which induces them to produce the viral proteins that train your immune system to recognize the virus. This technique itself is relatively new, and to deliver the messenger RNA to the cells, the vaccines leveraged years of research that had already gone into development of an HIV vaccine. In short, we got COVID-19 vaccines so quickly because we've gotten so much better at developing vaccines. So while there will certainly be future pandemics, science gets better all the time at responding to them. And I would say that that is a reason for optimism.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really do. And I do think that you're putting your finger on a very underreported, wonderful thing that came out of this era of crisis we've been in with COVID. But the problem for me with Omicron is I'm finally realizing that this pandemic situation is going to be with us for a much longer time than we all thought. I'm twice vaxxed and boosted. I'm under 65. So I know that it's very likely that if I get a breakthrough infection, I'm not going to go to the hospital or die. But with Omicron running through the land, I'm much more likely to get a breakthrough infection. And that has enormous ramifications on what we do in our lives. Do I dare go indoors with a bunch of strangers who could give me that breakthrough infection? Do I dare gather with my family, my elderly mother, my aunt who's a cancer survivor? Do I dare do that, knowing that Omicron could be infecting me in a asymptomatic breakthrough infection that I could then pass on to people who might not be able to survive it? And just the realization of that, despite the scientific wonders of the vaccines, it's still just a thoroughly dispiriting situation we're in.
It certainly can be. I will not attempt to argue you out of that. I will point out, however, that I think we tend to think about COVID variants in a remarkably pessimistic style, which is we assume, or at least we sort of preface every discussion of an emerging variant on the premise that it's going to be worse than what we saw before. And frequently, viruses mutate to become less deadly because it's not in the virus's interest as a viral species to kill its host, because the dead host cannot pass the disease on to other people. Viruses actually are more successful if they just live unobtrusively within a human body. So in theory, the most successful version of COVID is the one for which you have no symptoms at all, because that can just pass from host to host. And so in a way, variants are on our side in a weird way. Like the virus is not attempting to mutate in a particular direction, but it's not surprising to me that Omicron might be proving to be less deadly, because that's actually one possible outcome for a variant, and it makes a lot of sense for a successful variant to be less deadly because that makes it more communicable.
Right. No, you're correct. No doubt. I just wish we could press fast forward and go from this point where Omicron is about to run rampant through the United States to the point where maybe a few years from now where COVID is endemic. We get a shot for it like we get a shot for the flu every fall when it's getting cold, right? I want to get there now, and I don't want to have to go through this daily calculus of, do I go here? Do I go there? Is it too unsafe to do this and that? I'm just I'm just articulating the COVID fatigue that everybody in the country is feeling right now.
Yeah, I think the entire world would join you in that sentiment. So next, let's take one step away from the pandemic to the impact that COVID-19 has had on our lives. The pandemic hit some industries hard. Restaurants are a good example, and there was significant job loss. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that there were 5 million fewer jobs in September 2021 than there were in February of 2020. And the majority of lost jobs were in industries such as the leisure and hospitality industries, which pay low wages, so these workers were vulnerable.
Yes, and this is why New York is taking so long to recover, because it's ground zero for the hospitality industry.
Absolutely. As recently as October of last year, an estimated 12 million Americans were struggling to make rent, while nearly 30% of adults were having a hard time covering expenses. All of that is bad news. Lots of people have been suffering, and even those of us who kept our jobs were dealing with fear and uncertainty, and the difficulty during lockdown of connecting with family and friends who might have made these things easier to endure. Now, lockdown was eventually eased, though maybe temporarily, and the job market will improve with time. Sooner or later, we will no longer be dealing with COVID, but that's not my reason for optimism. I'm finding optimism in a different place. I'm sure you've heard of PTSD, Joe, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
But have you heard of the phenomenon known as post-traumatic growth?
No.
So Wikipedia defines post-traumatic growth as, quote, a positive psychological change experienced as a result of struggling with challenging, highly stressful life circumstances. In a nutshell, a great deal of stress or a really big challenge can lead you to take a hard look at your life and think about what's really important. These experiences can induce a deep psychological shift in the way you see the world and your place in it, in a way that can be experienced as deeply meaningful. Not everyone facing down trauma will undergo this experience, but those who do report changes in the following areas. First, a deepened appreciation of life. Second, improved relation with others. Third, they experience personal strength. Fourth, they perceive new possibilities. And fifth, it's common to experience a spiritual, existential, or philosophical change. Now, I would like to suggest that post-traumatic growth is at the root of something I've been hearing about lately, namely the Great Resignation. Have you heard about the Great Resignation, Joe?
Yes, I have.
Employers are having trouble retaining employees. Lots of people have been quitting their jobs. A combined 8 million Americans quit their jobs in July and August of 2021. The highest resignation rates were among mid-career employees. Managers have also been having trouble filling openings because, coming out of the pandemic, it would appear that fewer people are willing to accept bad jobs. I've seen a couple places in Seattle, one restaurant and a food counter in a grocery store, where the manager had posted an angry sign complaining that hours had been reduced because he was having trouble hiring workers. And employees at some very high-profile companies like Apple and Google have also been pushing back on the mandate to return to the office after more than a year of working at home. Meanwhile, I don't think it's coincidental that we've recently seen headlines on workers' unions making some headway at Starbucks and Amazon,
Yes.
two companies that have held a strict line on keeping their workforce non-unionized. I would like to suggest that a lot of people came out of the trauma of the pandemic with a new perspective on life and a new unwillingness to accept work conditions that fall short of what they're looking for in life. I'm seeing a lot of articles these days on the need for companies to think hard about their employee experience and improve it wherever they can if they want to hold on to those employees. So I'm calling this a reason for optimism. After several decades in which the job market was tilted strongly in favor of the employer, and employees were forced to accept flat wages, reduced benefits, and very little job security, I think we're finally seeing employees start to take back some power for themselves. And I'm calling that reason for optimism.
Well, I'm with you 100% on this one. I agree completely that this is a cause for optimism. And I'm very happy to see the union movement with fits and starts getting back into relevancy in the United States. You know, it's funny, when you first mentioned the term post-traumatic growth, I almost said that the image that came to my mind was, you're going to find this strange, when I visited Yellowstone Park, which is one of the great wonders of the earth as far as I'm concerned. One of the most beautiful scenes for me in Yellowstone was seeing the burned forest and how the little green buds and saplings were beginning to reassert themselves on the field that had been completely burned by the fire.
Right.
And I thought, boy, that's an example of post-traumatic growth, isn't it? And it's also very beautiful and gives you a feeling like life is coming back and life is resilient. And instead of feeling terrible seeing that scene, that vista when I was at Yellowstone, I actually felt oddly wonderful looking at that scene. Like this is a sign that life it can come back and it could be more beautiful than it was before.
Yeah.
So that's the first thought that came to mind when you mentioned post-traumatic growth. But I think your example of workers reaching their level of tolerance with the way they've been treated all these decades is in fact a human sign of green saplings, growing a different way, replacing something that needed to be burned.
Yes, exactly. I believe in Brave New World, a dystopian novel. The premise is that the entire population is drugged into just sort of a feeling of apathy so that they don't ever question anything. And I think the flip side of that is when you experience something as awful as COVID-19, it really does kind of force you to look at things and ask whether or not the things that you've accepted as normal are good enough. And maybe you're willing to walk away from a bad job so that you can have a life that includes something better.
Yes.
And so there's a resilience to the human condition where bad things don't always lead to worse things. Like sometimes bad things knock us out of a comfortable routine that isn't serving us and sets us on a path towards something better.
Yes. Agreed.
Okay, so our next reason for optimism also lies in the world of work. While we were working from home over the last 18 months or so, many of us leveraged new digital tools, especially video chat platforms like Zoom and WebEx, which made that a much more workable scenario. And one thing we didn't need to deal with was the daily commute. My personal commute during lockdown was about 10 steps long, from my kitchen to the desk I set up in the corner of our living room. Now, several decades ago, or a few decades ago, research told us that one of the worst things in every person's life is the daily commute. Behavioral scientists conducted an experiment in which they gave beepers to people, and at random intervals during the day, they'd beep the subjects and ask them to write down two things: what they were doing in that moment and how happy they felt. The study showed that, by a considerable margin, people were most unhappy during their commute to and from work. It's long been part of the American dream that you would get a good job in the city and then buy the house in the suburbs with a big backyard. The problem is getting to and from that job in the city is a huge pain in the neck. A long commute is associated with problems like stress and fatigue, anxiety, hostility, social isolation, and elevated blood pressure. But one thing I'm seeing in the job market today is a much greater prevalence of jobs defined as remote or work from home. Coming out of the pandemic, companies are more confident with a workforce that is rarely or never in the office. So I'm feeling optimistic that the work commute is about to become a much less frequent obligation. In the longer term, we might even imagine a trend away from people congregating in urban centers, because that's where the jobs are, and toward living where they want, because they no longer need to be within commute distance of their work. Which might be the way we get out from under the topic of episode 34 of Mansplaining, the very high price of housing in cities like Seattle, New York, and San Francisco. And that might also furnish us with a partial solution to problems like traffic congestion and greenhouse gas emissions. So I'm feeling optimistic.
Well, those are nice connections you're making to the problems of work that we outlined in our prior episode. I am personally in the minority on this particular one about commuting because my commute to my office was about a 25-minute walk that I very much appreciate and was very much a part of my daily and weekly exercise regimen.
You're a lucky man, Joe.
Yeah, no, I know I'm a lucky man, but when the office closed, I was one of the few employees who was a little upset that he didn't get to commute anymore. But that said, we've had endless town halls and Zoom forums among the people in my company about what are the positives and negatives of the work at home situation. And the one thing that everybody is, except me, is unanimous about is that the commute sucked. And that's one of the good things about working from home. So I certainly see that as a net positive writ large for the population. It's just I'm not sure I would be happy with a new normal that did not involve some interaction in an office environment for the, camaraderie and collaboration that comes from that, which you just can't get that from Zoom or WebEx.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to go immediately from everyone in the same office to everyone working remote. I think we're probably pass through an intermediate stage. Like my last two jobs,
hybrid.
My teams have been partly local and partly distributed, where I have some people who are sitting right next to me and some people who live literally on the other side of the country, but we're all on the same team. And every few times per year, the people on the other side of the country will fly in so that they can meet in headquarters. And then we tend to go out to dinner and we have like big team activities. But otherwise, we communicate by way of Slack and WebEx, video conferencing and direct messaging. And we talk on the phone and we text. I do think that in the new world of work, we do need to figure out how to collaborate as effectively as we can collaborate when we're face to face. I think there are challenges there and some questions that haven't been answered.
Yeah, agreed. And I also think there are certain mundane details, like if you're no longer going to use a desktop PC located in your workstation in the office, is the company going to buy you a laptop, buy you a printer, buy you a scanner, pay for your Post-its and all the other stuff you use in the course of a workday? That is yet to be resolved either, but I think it's bound to happen in the years to come, because I do agree with you that we're headed toward a hybrid work from home, work in the office environment, which may then be followed by an all remote work experience. I think that is possible.
Yeah, which would very much change really the experience of work itself and the possibility of where you can do it from.
Yeah.
Okay, so while we're on the topic of reduced emissions, let's talk about renewable energy sources. For decades, the conventional wisdom has been that while things like solar and wind power were better for the environment, they were far too expensive for widespread use. Now the equation has been flipped on its head. With improved technology and production processes, renewables have become less expensive than power from fossil fuels. Over the last 11 years, solar power has dropped in price by 90%, and offshore wind has dropped by 70%. New solar farms are now the cheapest sources of electricity, and wind is second cheapest. And perhaps as a direct result of this, the share of global electricity from renewables grew from 18% in 2009 to nearly 28% in 2020. Now, the coal and petroleum industries will most definitely spend a lot of money on political lobbying to protect their position as long as they can. But in the end, we do live in a capitalist society, for better or worse, and under capitalism, the lowest price almost always wins. So I would call that reason for optimism. It's looking like renewable energy is poised to take over, and you and I might even save a bit of money in the long run.
Well, the sooner that happens, the better. We did the Green New Deal podcast where I mentioned that wind and solar would soon be cheaper than coal and oil and gas. But the entrenched interests that are continuing to subsidize fossil fuels just seem so powerful to me right now in the immediate future.
Yeah. All that is true. I still think it's significant that we've moved from renewable energy being both an economic and a political problem to now where it's almost entirely a political problem.
I agree with you. I think that there is the lower price of renewables has its own inexorable logic that will eventually be assimilated by everybody in the body politic. It just is happening slower than I hoped it would happen. And with the climate emergency beckoning, every additional year we delay on this move to renewables is another year we're going to have 65 degrees and tornadoes ripping through the country in the middle of December in Minnesota,
Right. None of these things are moving as quickly as I would like, but they're at least moving in the right direction.
Yes.
So next, let's turn our attention to a big, scary problem facing the world, the threat of overpopulation. We've all heard the familiar refrain. Human population is growing at an unsustainable rate. Eventually, this will result in worldwide overpopulation, poverty and food shortages, environmental devastation, you name it. The English philosopher Thomas Malthus built an entire career on the idea that the rate of food production increases at a linear rate, while population grows exponentially. He predicted that this would ultimately result in a catastrophic event in which famine and war triggered rapid human depopulation. Now, the modern engine for population growth has been the Third World, where families tend to have a lot more children than families in the developed countries. Across the board in the developed world, the birth rate is below 2 children per woman. This is a zero growth trajectory. In the Third World, though, and particularly in Africa and Central Europe, there are 4 or more children born per adult woman. And this has encouraged some people, including quite recently a member of the British royal family, to suggest that some sort of artificial restraint on African baby-making is needed to prevent worldwide catastrophe. However, it turns out there's a pretty simple and much less racist way to think about this problem. As Hans Rosling points out in a famous TED Talk, which I will link to in my sources for this episode on our Facebook page, there is a very strong correlation between higher standards of living and lower birth rate. Why is that? Reduced poverty and a higher standard of living have the effect of reducing child mortality rates. And put simply, when parents feel confident that their children will survive to adulthood, they have fewer children. And the reason for optimism here is that the percentage of people living below the poverty line in Africa is on the decline. As with other things, it's not declining as fast as we would like it to, but the world is making progress on this. So that's 2 reasons for optimism rolled into one. Over time, a lower percentage of people are going hungry, and as a direct consequence of this, we can expect human population growth to slow or even stop.
Yeah, really interesting idea. And the first thing that comes to mind is, are we consciously aware of this? It just seems to me like this is not, that's not part of the conversation that's happening in families in the West, in the developed world. Well, our Johnny and Janie are able to live to adulthood, so we don't need to have a third, you know? It just seems more, this is more nature and not nurture, I guess is what I'm suggesting, right?
Yeah, it does raise a very interesting question of the level of calculation at the individual level, where a mother is thinking, how many kids should I have? Well, I'm pretty confident that the 2 that I already have are not going to die, at the age of 10. So I feel like I'm done here.
Yeah.
You do really wonder how this shows up, but there's just such an obvious and very clear correlation between, as the mortality rate goes down, the number of children per woman also goes down, that somehow the 2 are linked. And the question is if it's just like on some subconscious level where it just gets triggered, or if something else is going on. But I don't know. I do not have an answer to that question, but I can say that if we eradicate poverty in Africa, the birth rate in Africa will plummet. So we don't.
Yes.
Unlike some members of the British royal family, we don't have to say we need to figure out a way to stop these people from having babies. We just need to figure out a way to get them out of poverty. And that feels like a much better way of thinking about that problem.
Yeah, and listen, it's not just members of the British royal family. There are a lot of American intellectuals, particularly right-wing intellectuals, who have been talking about how we're not replacing our population and how this is a potentially catastrophic thing for the United States. When in fact, what you're suggesting, it's the opposite. It's the sign of maturity and confidence, and a very good thing that population's going to decline.
Yeah, it's a sign that mothers aren't afraid that their kids are going to die. It's a sign that children are able to get medical help. It's a sign that women are given advice on their pregnancies before they come to term.
Yeah, I guess my initial comment was more thinking back to our grandparents or great-grandparents' generation, where all of us could probably tell stories about somebody 2 or 3 generations older than us who had a family of 11 children, and 3 of them died in infancy. I mean, that was a very common thing 100 years ago. So I could certainly see how having more children was a very conscious reaction to child mortality at that time. It's just the piece that it's harder to grasp is whether that calculation's going on in families today. There's certainly the trend line, as you pointed out, but it's probably not a conscious thing the way it was 100 years ago.
No. And, just something occurs to me now, which is that it could be a function, at least partly a function of the fact that so many families now are childless. Like my parents had 3 kids, me and 2 sisters. I have one sister who has 2 children. I have another sister who has no children. I have no children. And probably what's much more common nowadays than it would have been for our grandparents' generation, or certainly our great-grandparents, is couples who, for professional reasons or other personal reasons, just choose not to have any children at all, which, of course, would affect the overall average of number of children per adult women, is that just there are fewer children. Like the women themselves might be having, 2, 3, 4 children, but if there's fewer women who are having children, the average still goes down. So it could be a function that one of the correlating factors to a society that's growing out of poverty is that there are more women in the workforce who choose not to be mothers because they're excited about their careers. And that also could have the effect of driving the population growth down.
Yes.
And that brings us to our final reason for optimism today, which is optimism itself. Optimism is what provides us with resilience. It gives us the spark to go on when times get tough. But research has shown that navigating life successfully calls on a specific type of optimism. There's a great graphic in an article on the website of the Potential Project, which I will link to in the sources for this episode, that charts a continuum from complete pessimism at one end to total optimism on the other. At the furthest extreme of pessimism, your mind is at war with what you perceive in the world, and that locks you into a downward spiral of hopelessness and despair. Acceptance of the way things are can raise you out of pessimism, but only to a state of apathy, and this in turn can lead to disengagement from the world's problems. Conviction that you have agency in the situation, that you can do something to change your world for the better, raises you out of apathy and into optimism. But you can go too far down this path. You want to stay realistic and not just assume that everything will be okay completely on its own. What researchers call wise optimism is a state in which you accept that there are problems in the world and you believe that you can do something about it, but you stay out of magical thinking and remain realistic about what is possible and what is not. When confronted by a difficult situation, they recommend writing down the features of the situation you find troubling, then identifying which of those features are completely outside your control. Set those aside and think about what you can do with what's left. Optimism, when it is wise, encourages us to engage with the things that are within our power with the intent to make things better and the conviction that together we can make a difference. On my better days, I'd say I am a wise optimist, or at least I aspire to be. What do you think, Joe? After today's episode, are you feeling more wisely optimistic?
Maybe. And I don't mean to be flippant here, but what's the good news in that last piece? Is it that, are you postulating that more people are wisely optimistic today than they were before?
No, I'm making a bit of a turn there. That's optimism empowers change. And by focusing on the positive on things like today, we basically engage ourselves in that change and perhaps maybe inspire a few people who are listening to think about the things in their world that they can change. The optimism itself is empowering and drives positive change. And so optimism is a reason for optimism because optimism breeds positive change.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I agree. And I guess my answer to your question is I aspire to be wisely optimistic. But I think I fall short, and I may be a kind of a corollary of that, which I read somewhere a description of something called defensive pessimism. And I really identified myself in that description. It's kind of like you're about to do something you've never done before. So you brainstorm all the possible things that could go wrong about that. And you've got solutions all set up, fixed, so that when those things happen, you can roll with the tide. And if they don't happen, it's kind of gravy, That's kind of describes how I am.
Yeah, protecting yourself against the worst case scenario that you can imagine, but not necessarily driving towards a glorious new future.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I have days like that as well. There's certainly situations in which that's my approach, is that, well, like particularly if there's a work situation where I am not expecting a chorus of applause when I present the thing that I'm working on, I would definitely go through that exercise you described to prepare myself for the more negative reception that I'm expecting. And those are not good days. I do not feel good on those days. The best feeling I have on those days is relief if the bad thing didn't happen. So I would like to be more wisely optimistic than the alternative.
Yeah, and it is a challenge to be widely optimistic right now. Right. I think it's a challenge we should all aspire to. But boy, the daily news is just such a downer. It's tough to be optimistic.
It can be. But I do hope that mansplaining the outcome of this podcast is not convincing people that we're all screwed. Just throw it in like we're doomed. Like the outcome of this podcast should be like empowering people with greater understanding to decide, how are they going to operate in the world, ideally towards something that's a little bit better than what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I agree. That's the reason why we do this. And but it is interesting, I must say, to get a little meta here about my reactions to most of your points were kind of mildly negative. And that in itself is interesting,
Yeah.
That's kind of the filter through which I'm viewing the world right now. And I don't consider myself to be a doom and gloom type of guy. So if this is the filter I'm using to approach the world right now, that's a little bit sad. And maybe we can extrapolate from that to the rest of the population that,
Yeah.
This is why Joe Biden is getting blamed for the spike in COVID deaths, because everybody's life is a shit show right now. And it's hard to put that lens of wise optimism on the events of the world.
It's definitely a challenge. I think it's a discipline. I think it's a choice you make. And really, at the end of the day, it's a self-interested choice, because being optimistic feels better than being pessimistic. And so it's just a nice thing you can do for yourself to not think, wow, everything's terrific. I wouldn't suggest that, but think this is a world in which the choices that I make matter, and that I can choose things that are a little bit better.
Yeah. Well, speaking of choosing, I hope you chose a wisely optimistic topic for me next time.
We will see. We will see. Because here's my question. This is the season of giving, and many people make charitable donations this time of year. So I would like to ask you about the topic of altruism. There are at least two academic disciplines, behavioral evolution and economics, in which some prominent scholars have argued that altruism does not exist. They argue that humans are innately selfish creatures, and when it seems we are doing something to benefit others, we are actually doing those things to benefit ourselves in some way. This line of thought has always bothered me. I like to think of myself as a pretty generous person, and it does bother me to think that I'm just putting on a show. So please look into this, Joe, and tell me, on what basis do these scholars argue that altruism is a myth, and do you think that they are correct?
Ooh, boy. Okay. So I kind of feel like your response to my framing wise optimism in the question is touche. Now I need to decide whether I'm going to take an optimistic or pessimistic spin on the topic of altruism. So challenge accepted.
Yeah, the softball's headed your way, and we'll see which direction you bash it.
Right. and I need to decide whether it was headed for my head or my back. Okay, folks, if you like this episode of Mansplaining, or if you want to leave a comment about this or any other episode of the podcast, please go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast. You can like us there. We welcome your feedback, and we welcome topic ideas for future episodes. And that's all for this edition of Mansplaining. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you next time. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.